To declare a recess of the committee at any time, and all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. This hearing is entitled A Legislative Proposal to Impede North Korea's Access to Finance. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Today's hearing will examine draft legislation that would impose secondary sanctions on foreign banks whose business supports the North Korean regime, whether directly or indirectly. By encompassing virtually all of North Korea's economic activity, these measures would represent the toughest financial sanctions yet directed at Pyongyang. This means going after coal, petroleum, textiles, and minerals, as well as North Korean laborers abroad. In addition, the bill would incentivize greater compliance with UN sanctions by leveraging our vote at the international financial institutions where certain countries with lax enforcement go to seek assistance. This bill puts those countries on notice. This proposed legislation has been informed by the committee's ongoing work on North Korea, as well as the UN panel of experts' evaluation of existing sanctions effectiveness. Needless to say, North Korea's 6th nuclear test on September 3rd, coupled with its repeated launching of intermediate and long-range ballistic missiles, underlines that more must be done. As a result, the legislative draft we'll be looking at lays out a choice. Foreign banks can either do business that benefits North Korea, or they can do business with the United States. They cannot do both. As many of us here today are aware, this is a similar approach to the one taken in 2010 against Iran, which helped compel the Ayatollahs to negotiate over their nuclear program. While there are differences of opinion over how successful those negotiations were, there is consensus, I believe, that in the absence of secondary sanctions affecting banks, Tehran would have been far less incentivized to even engage in talks. A focus on banks is especially important given how North Korea has evaded sanctions in the past. As Dr. John Park of Harvard's Kennedy School testified before this subcommittee in July, the North Koreans have moved much of their trading activity offshore using third country brokers and front companies. The specter of financial sanctions may concentrate the minds of foreign banks so that the entities identified by Dr. Park and others have fewer options to carry out transactions and mask North Korean involvement. Having said that, this bill would expand the scope of our sanctions to encompass even actors engaged in conventional trade with the North. Given North Korea's unchecked hostility, broadening our efforts in this way appears essential. Nevertheless, China's response to stronger sanctions has been cited as a concern, as the country accounts for an estimated 90% of North Korea's trade. Some have therefore argued that harsher sanctions now may damage cooperative efforts with Chinese leaders to curb North Korea's weapons program. But I would submit that those critics should be far more sensitive to a quarter century of failed multilateral efforts to rein in Pyongyang. There comes a time when caution, or, quote, strategic patience, as one administration phrased it, becomes a euphemism for self-delusion. As this subcommittee learned from its hearing in July, if China is not part of the solution to North Korea, it is part of the problem. Chinese officials have fallen short on enforcing UN sanctions that Beijing itself has signed on to. And as the UN Security Council talks following the North's 6th nuclear test have demonstrated, it is still unclear if China is committed to meaningfully tackling the North Korean threat. Finally, we should acknowledge that Kim Jong-un's eagerness in forcing the withdrawal of U.S. troops from the region may not be entirely inconsistent with Chinese interests. For all the breathless talk of China exerting influence around the globe as a rival to U.S. power, we are curiously asked to believe that its hands are tied when it comes to a small, economically dependent state next door. Well, if Chinese officials' hands are tied, then we should proceed with secondary sanctions so that their banks can assist international efforts to cut off North Korea's access to finance. If, on the other hand, China could do more than it has, then secondary sanctions may finally inspire it to do so. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing today, and I look forward to their testimony. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Gwen Moore, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
And thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to, in the absence of our ranking member of the full committee, I'd like to share some thoughts that she has committed to paper regarding today's hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us to discuss the legislative proposal aimed at expanding United States sanctions against North Korea and pressuring the international community to enforce those restrictions as well. The situation in North Korea is the most urgent and dangerous threat to peace and security that we face, and it's one that grows more dangerous as North Korea aggressively pursues the capacity to extend its nuclear reach to United States cities. In fact, there are no good options for dealing with North Korea. Most experts agree that a preemptive strike at this point on North Korea would be reckless beyond belief. Of the least bad options, I like the idea of pressing China to lean more heavily on North Korea, and I like the idea of tougher sanctions. But we should not confuse either of those things with a coherent strategy. And we should be clear upfront about our goals and objectives and what we expect sanctions can accomplish. Any ratcheting up of sanctions must be coupled with aggressive diplomatic engagement by the United States and within a framework that would entail nuanced negotiations with North Korea, U.S. allies, and China. This would require unprecedented policy-making capacity and coordination across the United States government, as well as skilled policy coordination with our allies. It concerns me, therefore, that just as this crisis is accelerating, our diplomatic capabilities, which opens channels for crisis communication and reduce the risk of miscalculation, are diminished. Not only are U.S. ambassadorships to Japan and South Korea still vacant, the president has yet to nominate a permanent assistant secretary of state for East Asia and Pacific affairs. The legislative proposal before us today rightly recognizes the need to exert massive and immediate pressure on the North Korean regime, and importantly enlist China and others in this effort. Such a powerful approach towards sanctions, however, that have the capacity to reverberate throughout the global economy and present potentially disastrous unintended consequences, must also allow for a careful calibration in its implementation. We look forward to the witnesses' views on the proposal before us, as well as their views on how the U.S. can most effectively use its leverage to contain the alarming danger North Korea presents, and I reserve my time.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Moore for the time, and thank you all for convening this important hearing. Responding effectively to North Korea's provocations will require a variety of tools: credible deterrence and deft alliance management, skillful diplomacy, and the careful design of non-military sanctions. Here in the Financial Services Committee, we have jurisdiction over only one of those tools, sanctions. But I believe it's important that we always keep the broader picture in mind as we work to perfect the discussion draft which has been put forward today. Even with perfect compliance, I believe it is very difficult to stop any country from pursuing a course of action which it views as vital to its survival through sanctions alone. These challenges are even greater when dealing with a regime like North Korea, a regime which relies on force to stay in power, a regime which has demonstrated indifference to the incredible suffering of its own people, a regime which can easily make sure that its elite and its nuclear program are the last to feel any pinch. Done right, however, sanctions can make further North Korean advances slower and more costly, giving more time for other policy tools to work. And I look forward to hearing from our distinguished witnesses about how this proposed draft fits into a larger strategy. My constituents in the South Puget Sound, who include the service members at Joint Base Lewis McChord, are counting on us to respond to this crisis in a responsible manner. So too are our allies, like South Korea and Japan, and an Asia-Pacific region which has enjoyed decades of peace and prosperity, in large part because of the credibility of U.S. security guarantees and a broader commitment to the region. We cannot afford to fail them. We have to get this right. And I'm hopeful that with steady American leadership, working in a bipartisan manner, we will get this right. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back, and because of the significance of the issues under consideration in this hearing and the importance of the North Korean threat to our homeland and to the interests of our country, a number of members from the full committee have expressed interest in participation in today's subcommittee hearing, and so I ask for unanimous consent that members on the full committee, but not on this subcommittee, may join in this hearing. Without objection, that is ordered. Today we welcome the testimony of a distinguished panel of witnesses. First, David Albright, who is the founder and president of the Institute for Science and International Security. He has written numerous assessments on the secret nuclear weapons programs throughout the world. Mr. Albright has published assessments in numerous technical and policy journals, including the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, Science, Scientific American, Science and Global Security, Washington Quarterly, and Arms Control Today. Mr. Albright has also co-authored 4 books, including the World Inventory of Plutonium and Highly Enriched Uranium, as well as Peddling Peril, How the Secret Nuclear Trade Arms America's Enemies. Prior to founding the Institute, Mr. Albright worked as a senior staff scientist at the Federation of American Scientists and as a member of the research staff of Princeton University's Center for Energy and Environmental Studies. Anthony Ruggiero spent more than 17 years in the U.S. government as an expert in the use of targeted financial measures. Most recently, he was a foreign policy fellow in the office of Senator Marco Rubio and was Senator Rubio's senior advisor on issues relating to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Mr. Ruggiero has also served in the Treasury Department as Deputy Director and then Director of the Office of Global Affairs in the Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. Prior to joining Treasury, Mr. Ruggiero spent over 13 years in various capacities at the State Department, including as Chief of the Defensive Measures and WMD Finance Team. He was also Non-Proliferation Advisor to the U.S. delegation to the 2005 rounds of the six-party talks in Beijing and participated in U.S.-North Korea meetings following the identification of the Macau-based Banco Delta Asia as a primary money laundering concern. He has also served as an intelligence analyst covering North Korean nuclear and missile programs and proliferation activities. Bruce Klingner specializes in Korean and Japanese affairs as the Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. He is a frequent commentator on the region in U.S. and foreign media. Mr. Klingner's analysis and writing about North Korea, South Korea, and Japan are informed by his 20 years of service at the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency. From 1996 to 2001, Mr. Klingner was CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea, responsible for the analysis of political, military, economic, and leadership issues for the President of the United States and other senior U.S. policymakers. In 1993 and 1994, he was the chief of the CIA's Korea branch, which analyzed military developments during a nuclear crisis with North Korea. Elizabeth Rosenberg is a senior fellow and director of the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. In this capacity, she publishes and speaks on the national security and foreign policy implications of energy market shifts and the use of sanctions and economic statecraft. From May 2009 through September 2013, Mrs. Rosenberg served as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, and then to the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. In these roles, she helped to develop and implement financial and energy sanctions. She also helped to formulate anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing policy and oversee financial regulatory enforcement activities. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Albright, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Barr, Ranking Member Moore, and other members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. North Korea's September 3rd nuclear tests, its 6th overall, and by far the largest in terms of explosive yield, demonstrates its resolve and commitment to developing a nuclear arsenal able to strike its enemies. During the last few years, North Korea has embarked on an intensive nuclear weapons testing and production campaign that has included the construction and operation of many nuclear facilities, 3 underground nuclear tests, and tens of ballistic missile launches. Its apparent goal is to have tens of nuclear warheads of many varieties mated to ballistic missiles with ranges stretching to intercontinental distances. Few doubt that North Korea can now launch nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles that can strike our allies, Japan and South Korea. There is rightly more skepticism that North Korea is yet able to deliver a nuclear warhead to an American city, but it is making rapid progress toward that goal. I continue to believe that North Korea can be peacefully denuclearized. However, substantive negotiations appear unlikely unless North Korea changes its path. Given North Korea's unwillingness to enter denuclearization talks and its provocative behaviors, there is little choice but to exert more pressure, including harsher sanctions and additional trade cutoffs. The UN Security Council resolution passed on Monday is an important step in that direction. A near-term priority is to far more effectively isolate North Korea from the regional and international financial system. A central problem is that many countries are not enforcing sanctions effectively, or are in some cases willfully disregarding them. Punitive measures are needed to encourage compliance and deter violations. Additional U.S. legislation that supports that goal is useful. North Korea appears to target entities and persons engaging in activities in violation of UN Security Council sanctions in tens of countries with weak or non-existent trade control systems, poor proliferation financing controls, or higher than average corruption. Although a range of remedies are needed to fix the poor performance in general of many of these countries, the creation of punitive measures may be an effective means to accelerate more compliant behavior in the short term among a wide range of countries where entities and individuals see North Korea as a quick way to make money or obtain military or other goods either more cheaply or unavailable elsewhere. Dealing with China's trade with North Korea is in a different category. North Korea has depended on illegal or questionable procurements for decades for its nuclear and other military programs. And as the chairman pointed out, they've gone offshore quite successfully to be able to acquire those goods. And they don't just acquire them, let's say, in the country such as China. They're able to get those goods from the United States, Europe, and Japan by operating in China and exploiting China's weak export control and sanctions legislation. Although China is improving its export control laws, Beijing has certainly not done an adequate job of enforcing its laws and sanctions against illegal exports and retransfers to North Korea, and I provided several examples in my testimony. China remains North Korea's central, perhaps unwitting, supply conduit for its nuclear weapons program, and one of the priorities is to change that. The Trump administration's efforts to sanction Chinese, and for that matter, Russian-owned companies and individuals that significantly support North Korea's weapons programs are a positive step. But unless China and Russia show dramatic improvements in ending their nefarious trade with North Korea, the United States should go further and sanction major Chinese and Russian banks and companies for any illicit North Korean dealings. Both countries have gotten away for far too long and have faced too few consequences for turning a blind eye to the sanction-busting business activities of their citizens and those of North Korea in using their economies for nefarious purposes. North Korea has a diplomatic path out of its isolation and sanctions if it negotiates a full, verified denuclearization of its nuclear and long-range missile programs. Any such negotiations would need to repair past mistakes where North Korea was able to evade inspections and continue expanding its nuclear programs. An agreement would also need to allow unprecedented inspections and access, allowing for a full accounting of the program as part of a denuclearization process. Although this prospect seems unlikely in the short term, given North Korea's current trajectory, it is important to keep this goal available as a matter of U.S. policy in case increased sanctions can convince North Korea to negotiate in earnest. Likewise, the Trump administration should continue to make clear that regime change is not its goal. And particularly if the goal is to seek cooperation from China, that becomes even more important.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Okay.
Thank you. We'll look forward to the remainder of your testimony during the question and answer session. And Mr. Ruggiero, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Barr, Ranking Member Moore, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today on this important issue. Often, U.S. policy toward North Korea gets stuck in a cycle whereby a North Korean provocation is met with a strong American rhetoric and/or a token increase in sanctions, a pattern repeated over and over. If we don't break this cycle, the Kim regime can keep distracting the United States with its repeated provocations. We must ensure that U.S. response to every North Korean provocation advances our goal of denuclearizing North Korea. Some experts will call for the White House to negotiate a freeze of North Korea's nuclear program with claims that it will reduce the threat and eventually lead to denuclearization. But we have seen this movie before, and its ending is not encouraging. North Korea has made it clear it has no interest in denuclearization. To the extent that Pyongyang is interested in negotiations, it's only for the purpose of extracting concessions in exchange for promises it will quickly violate, as it did with the 1994 agreed framework. In testimony before this subcommittee in July, I noted that U.S. sanctions did not have a serious impact because they have insufficiently targeted enough of Pyongyang's international business, nor have they targeted non-North Koreans facilitating sanctions evasion. Fortunately, this appears to be changing. The Trump administration has started to sanction North Korea's international business partners. Since March 31st, the U.S. has sanctioned 43 persons, of whom 86% operate outside North Korea and 54% are non-North Koreans. But this work is not done. As I note in my written testimony, recent U.S. actions against North Korea reveal 3 methods Pyongyang uses for financing prohibited activities. In slide 1, the first method starts with North Korean revenue in China following the sale of commodities brokered by Chinese firms and individuals. The payment then moves through a North Korean bank. From there, moving left to right, from there the funds move to a Chinese company and then a front company that accesses U.S. banks. This only happens because the U.S. banks are tricked into processing the North Korean transactions. This is how payment is made for the original item in U.S. dollars. This method is important to highlight with recent reports that Chinese banks have cut off North Korean accounts. The method relies on a ledger system between North Korea and China, where the Chinese firms and individuals hold these bank accounts. Slide 2, please. The second method was identified by the Justice Department based on information from an unnamed North Korean defector. Chinese Entity 1 on the left side of the slide, Chinese Entity 1 owes money to North Korean Entity 1, while North Korean Entity 2 owes a similar amount to Chinese Entity 2. The entities pay each other given the difficulties of moving money over the China-North Korea border. Slide 3, please. The third method was used by a Russian company to receive U.S. dollars for shipment of gas oil to North Korea. Again, this is very important given the new resolution that restricts energy sales. A U.S. bank would not process this transaction between sanctioned parties. To avoid this scrutiny, the front companies were created in Singapore to obscure the nature of the transaction, allowing almost $7 million in payments for this transfer. All 3 methods show that North Korean suppliers prefer U.S. dollar payments, providing a key vulnerability that Washington can exploit. This is why it is crucial for the Trump administration to issue fines against Chinese banks that are facilitating North Korea's sanctions evasion, matching the successful U.S. policy, as the chairman said, used to pressure European financial institutions that were facilitating Iran sanctions violations. The fines likely will prompt Chinese banks to increase scrutiny of North Korea-related transactions. To be clear, if non-governmental organizations here in Washington can find these transactions, I'm confident the largest banks in China with its significant manpower can find them too. Chinese banks need to do more or face severe consequences. In the meantime, it is important to remember that there are other political considerations at play. Pyongyang is trying to decouple the United States from our closest allies in South Korea and Japan. The Kim regime's ultimate goal is not a suicidal nuclear attack on the U.S. homeland, but rather using that threat to bolster Pyongyang's effort to reunify the Korean Peninsula and intimidate our Japanese allies. A sanctions approach that focuses on North Korea's financial activities has the best chance of success. Thank you again for inviting me to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ruggiero. Ms. Rosenberg, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Barr, Ranking Member Moore, distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. North Korea's alarming and dangerous recent ballistic missile launches and its 6th nuclear test highlight the need for much stronger pressure on the regime to limit its proliferation activities and cease its provocations. Financial sanctions should be a core part of a pressure strategy, along with forced posture and projection, and complemented by diplomatic engagement to move North Korea towards stability and denuclearization. I applaud the work of Congress to impose new sanctions authorities this past summer to tighten financial pressure on North Korea, along with complementary new sanctions from the United Nations. However, non-enforcement and evasion is gravely concerning, particularly when it comes to China, through which flows the overwhelming majority of North Korean international finance and trade. For some observers, the lack of sanctions enforcement is an immediate indication that the current sanctions framework is inadequate and that the United States should make secondary sanctions shock treatment mandatory to force other countries to comply with sanctions. While current sanctions authorities are already very aggressive to apply pressure on North Korea and its international enablers, I support the efforts of this committee to consider how mandatory secondary sanctions should be deployed to enhance pressure. We must not forget, however, that secondary sanctions require delicacy in their application. They may be counterproductive if they are so aggressive or politically incendiary that U.S. partners become utterly defiant, uncooperative, and create officially backed evasion schemes and impose retaliatory sanctions or economic punishments on U.S. firms abroad or a trade war. Ultimately, avoiding pitfalls in the use of secondary sanctions is primarily the responsibility of the U.S. administration, the body that implements and enforces sanctions. Congress must oversee aggressive sanctions implementation, but also give the administration adequate flexibility, even within the framework of mandatory secondary sanctions, to impose these measures and also manage their consequences for the United States and its partners. In addition to sanctions, U.S. policy leaders must deploy another form of economic statecraft to target North Korea, pushing for rigorous, risk-based approaches to global banks to identify and curtail proliferation finance. Currently, only large U.S. banks and some major European and Asian banks holistically pursue proliferation finance, leaving all other global banks significantly vulnerable to abuse by North Korean or other proliferators. For these other global banks, weak supervisory frameworks and expectations, lack of knowledge and resources, and insufficient prioritization of the threat means that they often take a mechanical approach to proliferation finance in the form of checking customers or transactions against entities sanctioned by the UN or national governments, sometimes, but not always, including the US. This presents obvious opportunities for proliferators to use front companies or proxies to get around limited compliance controls outside of major financial institutions, and we've just heard that described in some of the examples offered by my colleague, Mr. Ruggiero. The global standard-setting body for countering illicit finance, the Financial Action Task Force, endorses an approach toward proliferation finance along the lines of checking customers against sanctions list, instead of a risk-based evaluation of suspected proliferation conduct or proliferation typologies. This limited approach is inadequate, and we need much stronger leadership from the United States to clarify that global banks must take a more holistic, risk-based approach to screening and investigation for proliferation finance, and that there must be stronger public-private information exchange around known proliferation entities and typologies. In my written testimony, I outlined several specific points in response to your legislative discussion draft and some ideas for additional legislative measures. To briefly summarize a few items, I support your tough approach on secondary sanctions and encourage the inclusion of meaningful waiver provisions to manage unintended consequences. Also, I urge you to consider ways to provide additional financial support for the Treasury and State Departments and the U.S. intelligence community to expand the group of experts crafting and enforcing U.S. sanctions and offering technical assistance to foreign countries related to sanctions enforcement. Finally, Congress should mandate new bank supervision requirements for U.S. banks extending to their foreign branches, subsidiaries, and correspondents related to proliferation finance, and facilitate greater public-private information sharing on this topic to enhance global compliance and to impede the proliferation threat. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. And Mr. Klingner, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Barr, Ranking Member Moore, and distinguished members of the panel, it is truly an honor to be asked to speak before you. Although the North Korean nuclear and missile programs are indigenous, the regime requires access to foreign technology, components, and hard currency. Pyongyang maintains covert access to the international banking system through a global array of overseas networks and shell companies. Most of North Korea's financial transactions and the foreign entities that assist the regime continue to be denominated in U.S. dollars and thus are still going through U.S. banks. While the challenges in imposing targeted financial measures on North Korea may appear overwhelming, a closer examination reveals several encouraging characteristics. North Korea uses a limited number of trusted individuals to run its covert networks. Although the shell companies can be swiftly changed, the individuals responsible for establishing and managing them have remained often for years. By embedding their illicit activities into the global financial network, North Korean agents leave behind a digital trail, making them vulnerable to targeted sanctions. As C4ADS, a non-government organization using only publicly available information, discovered, while China accounts for almost 90% of total North Korean trade, the entire trading system consists of 5,000 companies. Those firms are centralized among a smaller number of large-scale trading firms, so that the top 10 importers of North Korean goods in China controlled 30% of the market. And those trading firms themselves are controlled by a smaller number of individuals. As such, the North Korean network in China is centralized, limited, and therefore vulnerable. Therefore, targeting a relatively small number of strategic choke points can have a disproportionate, disruptive ripple effects impacting multiple networks across multiple countries. Every law enforcement action could induce remaining components in the network to change routes, bank accounts, and procedures to less effective means. Even legitimate businesses will become more fearful of being entangled in illicit activity and more fully implement required due diligence measures. Cumulatively, these efforts reduce North Korea's foreign revenue sources, increase strains on the regime, and generate internal pressure on the regime. Sanctions enforcement must be flexible, innovative, and adaptive to the changing tactics of the target. But as North Korea altered its modus operandi, international law enforcement agents didn't keep pace. When North Korea shifted to Chinese brokers, the U.S. and UN agencies should have begun including them on sanctions lists, but lagged. To raise the cost of North Korean defiance, the U.S. must go beyond sanctions and diplomacy to include a full-court press to diplomatically and economically isolate North Korea from the international community and introduce tremors into regime stability. For too long, successive U.S. administrations have used sanctions as a calibrated and incremental diplomatic response to North Korean provocations rather than a law enforcement measure defending the U.S. financial system. The U.S. should target any entity suspected of aiding or abetting North Korean nuclear, missile, and conventional arms development, criminal activities, money laundering, or the import of luxury goods. The U.S. should also end de facto Chinese immunity from U.S. law. Beijing has not paid a price for turning a blind eye to North Korean proliferation and illicit activity occurring on Chinese soil. Washington has long cowered from targeting Chinese violators of U.S. laws out of fear of undermining perceived assistance in pressuring North Korea or economic retribution against U.S. economic interests. The North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act mandates secondary sanctions on third country banks and companies that violate U.S. sanctions and U.S. law. The U.S. should penalize all penalties, including Chinese financial institutions and businesses that trade with those on the sanctions list, export prohibited items, or maintain correspondent accounts for North Korean entities. Washington should impose significant fines on China's 4 largest banks at a commensurate level to the $12 billion in fines the U.S. levied on European banks for money laundering for Iran. And the U.S. should designate as a money laundering concern any medium or small Chinese banks or businesses complicit in prohibited North Korean activities. In conclusion, the most pragmatic U.S. policy is a comprehensive integrated strategy using all the instruments of national power to increase pressure in response to Pyongyang's repeated defiance of the international community, to expand information operations against the regime, to highlight and condemn Pyongyang's crimes against humanity, to ensure the U.S. has sufficient defenses for itself and its allies, while leaving the door open for diplomatic efforts. Sanctions require time and the political will to maintain them in order to work. It is a policy of a slow python constriction rather than a rapid cobra strike. Thank you again for the privilege of appearing before you.
Thank you for your testimony, and the chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes of questioning. Earlier this month, Russian President Vladimir Putin argued that the potential for North Korea sanctions to be effective remains limited. He claimed that the North Koreans would prefer, quote, to eat grass, unquote, than give up their nuclear weapons. How would you respond to those who claim that North Korea can always weather sanctions, that sanctions are not effective means of providing substance and meaning to our diplomacy, and that the Kim regime will never care if its economy will suffer in order for him to advance his weapons? And I'll ask all of you to briefly respond to that question.
Yeah, I think sanctions can have a very big impact in North Korea, partly for what you've been focusing on. They're not implemented. So there's a lot of room to really press North Korea to change its behavior. So I think that it's an extremely valuable tool. I think part of the purpose of sanction is I'd like to see North Korea eat its nuclear weapons. I mean, if that's what they choose, that the sanctions should start to have a cost, and I think that can actually be done. And particularly in North Korea, I think it's more vulnerable because it's surrounded by very big powers. This isn't like India and Pakistan or even Iran. North Korea is a relatively weak state that is surrounded by very powerful neighbors who do increasingly, even in the case of Russia, do not like its behavior.
Mr. Ruggiero, when you answer this question, could you also address the issue that, of course, North Koreans have been very creative in using third country brokers, as you testified, and front companies to mask their illicit transactions? And so as you answer the question, could you address our draft bill and whether you think that banks in third countries, above all China, actually possess the capacity to identify these brokers, middlemen, and front companies?
On Russia, I would start with perhaps President Putin should focus on his Russian companies that are facilitating North Korea's sanctions evasion, the ones that are working with a North Korean proliferation entity called Tangoon that was designated by the UN in 2009. That the U.S. sanctioned twice in the last couple of months. So perhaps if he had his own companies implementing sanctions, they would do a little bit better. I would also go back to 2005 and my experience at that time that Banco Delta Asia was very effective in targeting North Korea's financial activities. Now, there's a difference here because North Korea is frankly not stupid enough to concentrate all their financial activities in one bank. In terms of being creative, certainly people criticize sanctions because it's a game of whack-a-mole, and certainly it takes a lot of resources it did with Iran, but they're not invisible. As Mr. Klingner says, C4ADS can find them, the largest banks in the world can find them, and that's the part I would highlight, amongst other things in the legislation, is the due diligence. If we're not having, in particular, Chinese banks and U.S. banks looking for these activities, that is the problem. That is the serious problem here.
Ms. Rosenberg?
I would just add that China has a variety of strong interests in ensuring that there's no money laundering occurring in their own economy, not just related to their support or relationship with North Korea. So yes, I agree that China has the capability to go after, investigate, and take action on North Korean money laundering or the use of front companies in the Chinese economy. And if China, a country with extensive and sophisticated capital controls and that has taken measures including installing facial recognition cameras at ATMs in order to manage the flow of currency outside of China, then they can certainly do a lot more to recognize some of these trusted agents of the North Korean government that change their names and change their legal entities in order to launder money through China.
And Mr. Klingner, in the remaining time, if you could answer the question, and given how North Korea has evaded sanctions in the past, I wanted you to specifically address your quote that every UN Security Council resolution is an incremental step forward because of Chinese resistance. What we have is incremental law enforcement because we get what China allows us to have. If the Security Council resolutions are incremental, can we afford to just rely only on those, or do we need to do more in Congress?
Yes, I would tell Mr. Putin that sanctions have several objectives. They're enforcing U.S. law, they're imposing a penalty or a pain on those that violate our laws. They put in place measures to make it harder for North Korea to import items for their prohibited programs. It puts in place tougher proliferation or counter-proliferation measures. And we hope with all the other instruments of national power, it gets North Korea to abide by resolutions and laws. So I believe in doing the right thing, even if it's difficult, rather than throwing up our hands in despair. I believe in rolling up our sleeves and getting to work. On implementation,
and the time has expired. I'll have to yield to the gentleman from Illinois at this point, Mr. Foster. Maybe you can follow up during the remainder of the time.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. The financial sanctions we're talking about seem to be having two strategic goals. First is to cut off access to the technical components necessary for the development of what looks like to be many dozens of deliverable nuclear weapons in the next several years. What is the rough estimate? It has been widely reported that there's a lot of indigenous capability to make components inside North Korea at this point. So what is the rough amount of, what is the dollar figure, a decent ballpark estimate for the dollar figure for how much they have to purchase outside their country to execute that program that everyone's worried about?
I must confess, we don't. When we watch their business of acquiring equipment, and we focus mostly on the nuclear weapons program, they're buying things in orders of millions of dollars, and they're buying a lot. What they pay...
for example, it's a small fraction of $1 billion?
Yes, I would say for what, because they also have an infrastructure that's been in place for 40 or 50 years that they've been paying for incrementally. So while I see they seem to have no shortage of cash to buy things for the nuclear program, it's not huge amounts of money that they're using.
But in terms of trying to understand what sort of leaks we could tolerate in a sanctions regime designed to shut down their nuclear program, the answer is it would have to be really prohibitively tight.
Well, but these objects aren't, we have found anyway, and even in the case of Iran, where they were put in place more deceptive practices in their procurements, companies, governments are pretty good at detecting these things. I mean, we get a pretty good readout on a lot of what North Korea has acquired over the years. And we use that both strategically to understand their program and where it's going, but also tactically you get a lot of information about the networks that you can then act on. I mean, the problem has been China is not cooperating. So a company in, let's say a German company in China is getting help from its own government to try to defeat the North Korean efforts, but the Chinese government isn't doing very much, and they're the ones who should be doing the most. So
the goal, rather than to actually cut off money, which is a tough thing, is to actually increase information and increase our shaming ability. towards.
But once you identify the goods, you can then move to cut off the financing because they've got to pay for it, as my colleagues have talked about. And so I think these things build upon each other. And I think I would agree that going after the money is the way to hurt them most.
Well, the Chinese are well known to be sort of past masters at shuffling around money in black markets. Just if you look at the cryptocurrencies alone are just enormous compared to the amount of fund transfers that we're talking about having, to detect. So that's part of it. The second part of the question, the second strategic goal is actually to put pressure on the general economy. You'd mentioned, fuel, luxury goods, things like that. And the strategic goal there seems to be to put the fear in the leadership in North Korea of some sort of general unrest. My big worry on that is that if that actually comes to fruition, that it will be interpreted as a decapitating strike or something like that may trigger, even a pre-existing plan to retaliate, certainly against our allies, which, as what you mentioned, are very hard to defend against even their current nuclear capability. And so I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, the sort of risks that we're heading for.
Well, I think again, if the question was directed at me, maybe someone else could answer it.
Ms. Rosenberg, if she could.
I'd add to that. In addition to those two goals that you outlined, I would add a third, which has become what I see as a primary goal for Congress in contemplating mandatory secondary sanctions now. That third goal is putting pressure specifically on the foreign or third country enablers of North Korea's either specific proliferation programs or their economy more broadly. So going after China in particular, Chinese government entities or private institutions, banks and companies to encourage or compel their greater activity to advance as you outlined, the goals 1 and 2.
One of the functions of the pressure tactics, along with increased information operations and ensuring sufficient defenses, is to put greater pressure on the regime stability. We want to make Kim Jong-un fearful of regime stability if he continues down the path of defying the international community. That said, I disagree with those who advocate a regime change through a decapitation strike, either special forces or limited military strikes or a more general invasion. I think we are in a long-term game. It's like the Cold War strategy against the Soviet Union. We are deterring, defending, pressuring, and seeking to undermine.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the vice chair of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank to all of you witnesses for your testimony this morning. North Korea continues to destabilize Southeast Asia and threaten the safety of the United States and our allies in the region. The aggression shown by Kim Jong-un is equally as concerning as the methods he uses to finance his hostile activity. As the United States develops its strategy to further curb the threat posed by the DPRK, we must consider the profound effect that other nations have in enabling their actions. Because Kim has proven unresponsive to sanctions imposed by the West, we must consider actions to target and cut off the governments that prop him up. Nations that are unwilling to cut ties with the rogue regimes that encourage mass destruction, suppress their people, and threaten global security should not be in business with the United States of America. So with that, Mr. Klinger, can you explain the decision that China is faced with when determining what to do business with the United States or continue financial and technological support with North Korea? And furthermore, is this geopolitical issue for China, or is their investment in North Korea so substantial that there are severe financial implications to cutting them off?
What I would focus on is those entities that are acting against the UN resolutions as well as international and U.S. law. So entities that are violating our laws by misusing the U.S. financial system, money laundering, and other criminal acts, or that are engaging in facilitating the North Korean nuclear and missile program. So I would focus on more of a law enforcement basis of going after those entities, banks, businesses, individuals that are violating laws and resolutions.
Okay. For another question, let me follow up. If the DPRK eventually falls, what do you believe will be the fate of the North Korean people who have been exposed to decades of propaganda and oppression? And do you believe that they can adapt to a new way of life or a new form of governance?
I think the answer really, sir, is we don't know. They have been isolated for decades. They have been fed a daily diet of propaganda. That said, increasingly information from the outside world is getting in. So whether they believe the propaganda is a question we debate amongst ourselves. I think it varies by individual and by certainly the access they have to outside information. So that's one of the reasons, like with East Europe and the Soviet Union, we're trying to get information into the regime as much as we can to have the citizens question the propaganda that their government gives them.
Thank you. Mr. Albright, can you discuss the level of nuclear cooperation that North Korea has with other countries, and who outside of China do you believe to be of the greatest concern?
North Korea had considerable nuclear cooperation with Syria, including essentially building a nuclear reactor, which was bombed by Israel in 2007 prior to its operation. After that, it's been much harder to track any nuclear cooperation. There's suspicions that something could happen between North Korea and Iran, and that's a very, very active area. But as far as I know, nothing substantial has been found. During the six-party talks, North Korea committed in the Singapore Minute not to engage in proliferation. Obviously, we don't believe that is true, but I think it's on notice that if it does engage in significant nuclear cooperation, it'll be incredibly significant and can trigger or cross a red line that would be very hard for the United States not to take very draconian action, including even military action, if it involved plutonium, weapon-grade uranium, or a nuclear weapon.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Ruggiero, can you discuss the ways in which the U.S. government exposes and then targets money laundering activity related to DPRK? And if we impose secondary sanctions, are you confident that we can identify illicit transactions and stop them?
Well, I think what we're seeing now, in particular with China, is that the Trump administration is using a combination of the Justice Department tools and the Treasury Department tools. On 6 occasions since late May, they have used those tools to target money launderers, in particular those who are trying to do financial transactions through the United States, whether it's designations, requests for asset forfeiture, or the new one was what's called damning warrants, which were setting that up in U.S. banks, understanding that Chinese banks were going to do the transactions through U.S. banks. We need more of that. We need non-governmental organizations exposing these networks, and we need the U.S. government in particular putting the right amount of resources like we had on Iran on this problem. And I'm not sure that that latter part is happening yet.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to commend you on this bill draft. I look forward to working with you on it, look forward to co-sponsoring it. But
Thank you.
I've been doing this for 20 years. And for 20 years, I want to applaud you for getting these witnesses here. I've heard them often. They have enlightened me. For 20 years, I've sat on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and administration after administration, expert and expert has come forward. And we've gone from no nuclear weapon in North Korea to hydrogen bombs and near ICBMs in North Korea. What is less well known is that we've seen a 50% increase in the real GDP of North Korea, even while this regime is subject to sanctions. And then we're told we're going to change this with, quote, unprecedented sanctions, which just means a little bit more than what we've been doing before. Now, hydrogen weapons, ICBMs, 50% GDP growth. Some would say our policy has been a failure. But viewed another way, our policy has been a tremendous success, a success for the political class in Washington. We've been able to tell Americans we're doing all we can to protect them, and don't blame us. And at the same time, we've avoided doing anything that's difficult for the political class in Washington. What would those two difficult things be? The first would be to move beyond company sanctions to country sanctions. Because these gentlemen and the lady are experts in how we can tell China, go after this bank instead of that bank. But as long as China wants North Korea to be relatively stable, they'll find a bank that will do business with them, or they'll set one up, or they'll have, and yet country sanctions would be very difficult for the political class here in Washington, because that would really concern big companies who would wonder whether there is some risk to their supply chain. The other thing we haven't done, because it's politically difficult, is set realistic objectives. We keep banging the table and saying we're going to get this regime to give up all its nuclear weapons. Saddam's dead, Gaddafi's dead, and Kim Jong does not want to join them, and he's not going to give up all his nuclear weapons. And if he thought his regime was falling, he'd use them. So I want to commend you, Mr. Chairman, for the more realistic objective you have in this bill, because you sunset it upon verifiable limits on the nuclear weapons program. We might achieve those. So you've done something that those who spend their time on foreign affairs have been unwilling to do, and you've taken a very constructive step. But I've seen this go on. Let me ask Mr. Albright. If Kim Jong-un really thought his regime was going down, would he shrug his shoulders and go to The Hague for trial, or would he use his nuclear weapons?
I think if there was a conflict going on, I would imagine that he would use them. But if he's knocked off by some of his military generals, they very well may not use them. So I think it depends on how this unravels.
We can hope that they are saner and more peaceful than he is.
I think they would be moving to survive, and I think they would want to accommodate the neighbors.
I will point out Saddam's people didn't do that to him. Gaddafi's people didn't do that to him. And many of the people around Saddam and Gaddafi would have been worse than their leader. I've got, how has the North Korean economy grown by 50%? I'm trying to achieve 50% economic growth for my country in spite of all these sanctions. Ms. Rosenberg or anybody else?
Well, the first best answer to that is because they've been allowed to do that by a broad culture of noncompliance and non-enforcement with sanctions. So when active and...
Well, even if there were no sanctions, 50% economic growth, but I do also want to put this in context. Their economy is only $15 billion today. They use as much oil in the whole country as 150 gas stations. I got 150 gas stations on Ventura Boulevard. They grew from a very small base, and they are still very small, which makes the whack-a-mole a little bit more difficult because we're dealing with relatively small moles. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank each of you for your expert witness today and for the very important role that you play in these areas. As you may know, I authored an amendment to NDAA that was adopted that would prohibit the Defense Department from doing business with Chinese entities that provide material support to North Korea's cyber attacks. Earlier this year, I also led efforts to punish the Chinese government-affiliated firm ZTE, located in the USA, for violating export controls and selling embargo technologies to the North Korean government, which resulted in a $1 billion fine. Mr. Ruggiero, in your opinion, should my amendment capture ZTE? Is this an appropriate response? And would selling embargo technologies to North Korea be presumably used for cyber capabilities qualify as material support for North Korean cyber attacks?
On the amendment, in terms of anything that suggests that firms need to do better at identifying North Korea transactions and North Korea companies. And I think an amendment like that and the bill that's on the floor or that is proposed by the committee, the main goal is diligence and making sure that that DOD and others do not do transactions with companies in China. On cyber, I would just point out, that there's been some focus on North Korea cyber. There have been some reports recently, I believe this week, that North Korea is looking at Bitcoin and other cyber-enabled technologies to avoid sanctions, including trying to steal Bitcoin, I believe, from South Korea. So that's certainly a different turn on their illicit activities.
Do you believe these fines are an effective deterrent?
I mean, ZTE is a very interesting case. I think that everybody would equate ZTE with a large Chinese bank or large or medium-sized Chinese bank, and I think, as you well know, but others might forget, that ZTE actually agreed to that fine, and it was because ZTE was caught doing the transactions. And I would also point out that there are some North Korean front companies that are caught up in the ZTE.
You think, though, that it will be a deterrent?
I think against ZTE is what, and I think for the Chinese leadership. Look, if you're a senior official in the C-suite of a Chinese bank, you got to be worried right now.
Sure. Mr. Klinger, what other entities like ZTE provide the most material support to North Korean cyber attacks?
Well, I think a lot of the North Korean programs, as I said before, are indigenous, but they do need technology and components and
Any
knowledge.
specific ones you have in mind?
I don't know specific companies right now, sir.
Would you support blocking those firms from doing business with the U.S. or with the Department of Defense?
I think we should have a provision where you can do business with North Korea or you can have access to the U.S. financial system. So I think that is a choice that companies should have to make.
Yes, sir. Mr. Klinger, from a strategic standpoint, whenever we discuss responses to North Korea, as you said earlier, we're really talking about U.S.-China policy. And how can we better compel the Chinese government to work with us on this issue?
I think we need to separate law enforcement from diplomacy. We can continue on the UN path and cajoling and imploring and pressuring China to do more to implement required UN sanctions. But we don't need Chinese permission to enforce U.S. law. So we make clear to them that we are not going to negotiate away our law enforcement, so we can have, or we have had incrementally better UN resolutions, but we should not incrementally enforce U.S. law.
Thank you. Ms. Rosenberg, if you could pull your mic up a little closer when you respond. Could you elaborate on data sharing between the private and public sector that you mentioned in your testimony and what we could do, what type of enhancement and capabilities that could provide us and assist our efforts?
Sure. Thank you for the question. In my written testimony, I outlined a couple of ideas that I think would be a good opportunity for Congress to take action on increasing data sharing among financial institutions, so pursuant to 314B of the USA Patriot Act, instructing the administration to offer some new guidance and an adaptation in order to facilitate more information sharing between financial institutions within U.S. jurisdiction that will also transfer to their
Could this be done, if you don't mind me,
Yeah.
Could this be done protecting our privacies while enhancing our capabilities?
I believe that's absolutely feasible. To be sure, it's not it's not a walk in the park. There's a lot of serious civil liberties and privacy considerations here. But if we can pioneer this, as has been successfully done for the sharing of terrorism financing information, then it can and should be done for proliferation finance information as well.
Thank you. My time's expired. I appreciate your comments.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill.
Thank the chairman for this hearing, and I particularly appreciate the expertise of our witnesses. And I share Mr. Sherman's compliments of their long-standing work on this issue and appreciate your service for our government in office and out. Bill Newcomb was here a few weeks ago to talk on this topic from Johns Hopkins, and he basically in response to my question, I asked him, I said, we've been dealing with this, as you have, for 3 decades now, 4 presidencies. And I asked him, are we ever going to get serious about sanctions on North Korea? And why weren't these great sanctions proposed to President Clinton or President Bush or President Obama? And he said, I think the United States did too little for too long, and they're just now thinking about getting serious about it. But again, it depends on establishing this, meaning North Korea, as a national security vital interest. And boy, that confused me, because I watched TV in 2002 when President Bush declared North Korea part of the axis of evil. So I'm confused about why North Korea is so low on your chart, Mr. Ruggiero. You've been in government. Why is it that we're just now getting serious about North Korea? Tell me your top 3 reasons why for 20 years we have not sanctioned North Korea in an effective way.
Sure. It has not been the foreign policy priority. I mean, that is the bottom line. Whether you look at getting rid of the sanctions against or giving the money back on Banco Delta Asia in 2005, whether it's, and this is going to be bipartisan, whether it's removing North Korea from the state sponsor of terrorism, as Dr. Albright said, right after we discovered that they built a reactor in Syria, or whether it's looking at this Congress approving, insisting that North Korea be evaluated as a primary money laundering concern. And when you look at that detailed information provided last year, you see that financial transactions went back all the way to 2009. You start to ask the question, what have we been doing over the last 10 years? And the answer, unfortunately, is that it has not been the foreign policy priority. And when I hear that people suggest that this new administration policy is the same as the prior one, that is just frankly not true. As I said, they've gone after China 6 times. They've gone after Russia. They've moved North Korea up the chart. But there is a lot more to do. And the question of how are we going to get from this point to denuclearization? The point I would make on this administration is, Secretary Tillerson said it's a dial and it's at 5 or 6. It's the United States that's determining that it's not at 20 right now. And that's what we really need, and it should be moved to an extreme level so that North Korea will start to feel that impact.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the work Ambassador Haley is doing in the United Nations, but I don't think it is a substitute for increased pressure by the United States, and I thank the chairman for bringing this draft bill before us. You said, Mr. Ruggiero, in your testimony that another suggestion was mandated inspection for North Korean vessels. Is that a United Nations sanction? Is that an American sanction? How does one do that and be lawful? How does one do that in a legal manner?
Right. I think, the UN sanctions use the phrase, and even the new resolution uses this phrase, reasonable grounds that some kind of sanctions violation or prohibited material are being transferred. I believe, just as we did with Iran, you can create a group of like-minded countries, probably South Korea, Japan, Australia, UK, France, and Germany, that say, we interpret that clause to now say there are reasonable grounds that every shipment that North Korea puts back and forth from North Korea is a violation, and that it's subject to inspection. Of course, there are international law with regard to flag state consent and master consent and all of that. That would have to be worked out, but that would be a key element, just like the Proliferation Security Initiative in the 2000s.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have other questions, but I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to our guests. I really appreciate your testimony, written and verbal here. I've enjoyed your dialogue on the questions. And I just want to say that, perhaps we're shooting for too low of a goal. It seems that our goal there is a non-nuclear peninsula in Korea, except that most of the parties don't really want that outcome. And so it makes it a pretty hard outcome to attain. We seem to desire it, but we may be one of the few. South Korea doesn't want the North to have it, and as long as we got their back, I guess they're okay that they don't have them themselves. Japan doesn't want it, but the list might stop there, frankly. And so I think it might make sense to set a higher goal, which should have been our goal since 1950, which is an end state that does not have the United States defending the North Korean peninsula or the Korean peninsula altogether. What would it take to do that? Well, it would take peace. It would take the same sorts of conditions that led to the United States minimizing our presence in Germany, where the East and the West have reconciled. And so we haven't really moved down a path that pursues that. We've moved down a path that continues to escalate and continues to make seeking nuclear weapons somewhat rational for a really irrational guy, generation after generation. So I think that, begin with the end in mind, maybe perhaps why we have failed, along with lots of other things that my colleague Mr. Hill highlighted, just failure to act in the past. I do feel that we have a good track record in Iran to build on, and we've had good track records in other situations to use economic action to hopefully pursue a peaceful outcome to our desired end states. And I get that there's some concerns about trade with China. They're certainly a key part of our supply chains, but they're also a vital part of North Korea's supply chain. And at some level, when you look at the risk on supply chain management, I think we need to get to the point where we use all of the levers of U.S. power to force just like banks are forced to know your customer, the rest of the world needs to be forced to know your supplier. And part of that will be hard in China. But to enforce these good sanctions that I think are highlighted in the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act, it may take that. And Mr. Klinger, I think you highlighted a number of those things in your testimony. And I'd just like to say, how is it that we can take action down to the, let's say the small manufacturing company in China that's allied themselves with someone from North Korea, and they're moving products, services, and cash back and forth. What tangible steps can we take to make that, to close off that pipeline?
Well, I think there are a number of things, and first of all, it's really having the political will to do it. I have been surprised over the years that the U.S. has hesitated to enforce its own laws on the same degree to North Korea as we have done to a greater degree on other countries for far less egregious violations. So I think Mr. Hill's what were the three reasons? I might say naivete, wishful thinking, and lack of political will. So we've gone down the diplomatic path a number of times. We've tried freezes before and they didn't work. So going against companies, I think we need to give greater resources to the intelligence community and State Department and Treasury Department and sort of unleash the law enforcement. If you talk to officials in the government, they'll say, yeah, for years I've had a list of Chinese and North Korean violators in my drawer, and I'm sort of allowed to take out 10 or so every time there's a provocation, and then I have to put the rest back in the drawer. I think it's time to, empty the drawer, as it were, of going against all those entities that we have evidence for.
Yes, Mr. Albright. Mike.
Many of these companies are becoming multinational, and some of them come to the United States for their subcomponents. And I think what U.S. companies should be doing, and they haven't been doing it, is gaining assurance from those Chinese companies in writing that they will control the end use of their product that contains U.S. goods. Yeah. And I think that it's in U.S. law, but it should be applied much broader to start to push these Chinese companies. If they want to do business with the U.S., they have to meet our ethical and legal standards that you're not arming, in essence, our adversaries.
Thank you. My time has expired, but I get that my conclusion is that we have an existing law in place. We don't really need more laws. We need to enforce our existing laws. I look forward to any other feedback with our office to help bridge that gap. So thank you for your testimony, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Utah, Ms. Love, is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. In the wake of North Korea's 6th nuclear test, The proposal was circulated among UN Security Council members that would have frozen North Korean leaders' assets. Could our witnesses just very quickly comment on the desirability of expanding the prohibition in our draft legislation to include the members of North Korean government and the DPRK's Workers' Party? Just, we can start with you, Mr. Albright. Just.
Yeah, I think it's useful to do.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
I think there's already executive order on that. I would go in a different direction. I would say the issue on leadership assets is identification of those assets. So anything that can be done to incentivize those folks in banks in Europe in particular that might have information on leadership assets, I think that would be more beneficial.
Okay, Ms. Rosenberg.
I would certainly agree, and not just gathering that information and reporting back to the United States as a law enforcement matter, but also being able to share that among other banks, because there's never an instance where money laundering exists only in one financial institution. That will allow the variety of banks where these different assets are located to understand and map the network and to stop it.
Okay.
I'd absolutely go after leadership assets. Last year, the U.S. finally designated Kim Jong-un and I believe 9 others for human rights violations. So we have identified Kim Jong-un in the past. So, there is an executive order, January 2015, that gives us the authority to sanction any member of the North Korean government simply for being a member of the North Korean government. So I think we can and should go after not only Kim Jong-un, but the other senior leaders.
Okay. Along those same questions, Mr. Klinger, is that Klingner? Is that right? Okay, sorry. Could you discuss the potential for North Korea to assist countries such as Iran in developing nuclear weapons and advanced ballistic missiles?
As Mr. Albright was saying before, I think there's clearly been a missile relationship between North Korea and Iran. I mean, the first Shahid-3 missiles that Iran paraded were actually 100% made in North Korea. They were no-dongs and given a local paint job. The information on nuclear cooperation is much more difficult to get. We know North Korea was engaged in nuclear cooperation with Pakistan through the AQ-CON network and Libya and others. But the information with cooperation with Iran is much more difficult to get, particularly outside of government. I think there clearly is a relationship on the nuclear side between the two countries, but I think it's very hard to get particularly unclassified information on it.
With Mr. Albright, here's my connection between the two. I am concerned that if we continue to just try and be and we want to be as diplomatic as possible, we want to be able to work with people who are willing to work with us. However, we've seen North Korea incredibly defiant. We've seen them go test after test after test. To me, and I don't know if you have these same concerns, but it seems as if they're not a threat by itself, that the proliferation of these activities can support nuclear ambitions for other foreign regimes. Are you concerned about that at all?
Certainly. No, you have to be concerned with North Korea. I mean, because they like to go and sell things of value, and their nuclear assets are of increasing value. So you have to worry about that a great deal, and that has to be part of what's watched for and in the messages delivered to North Korea. I don't think it was a coincidence that the director of the CIA was on Fox News the other day raising this issue. And so I think it's important to send the signal that if North Korea crosses that line and is willing to sell weapon-grade uranium, plutonium, or nuclear weapons, that we will probably respond militarily to take out that regime. I mean, it may be a bluff, but I think it's important that that line has to be maintained and I would say enforced. And North Korea will get the message. They don't want to commit suicide.
I just have one more question. Given Beijing's reluctance to take a harder line with North Korea, what arguments should be brought to bear in order to convince the Chinese that pressuring the dictators of China is in their self-interest?
Well, China wants to be a responsible member of the international community. So a lot of these arguments on applying sanctions on Chinese companies are the same arguments we used in the 1980s against Germany, who was at that point arming Pakistan, Iraq, Libya, Iran, and probably several others with the wherewithal to make nuclear weapons. So I think these are not new arguments, and China wants to be responsible, and so it should start to act that way.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr.
The
Chairman.
gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Hollingsworth.
Well, good morning. I really appreciate everybody being here. And as everyone has reiterated already, this is an important and timely topic and something we need to take with grave earnestness. And so I appreciate the consistent testimony that everybody here has provided. One of the things that I really wanted to talk about was making sure that we've got partners that are engaged in this as well. And Russia comes to mind. And my concern has continued to be that they don't have an interest in enforcing sanctions at the same level that we do, and a willingness to combat this issue. The more the United States continues to be, I'll use the word distracted, and I don't mean that lightly, but distracted by North Korea, the better off they may see themselves. And so can you talk a little bit about what we can do to engender some cooperation and willingness on behalf of Russia to be able to participate in whatever solution this looks like? And that's for any of the panelists.
Thank you for the question for us. I think a good strategy is one that we've discussed here primarily with regard to China, but in this case applying it to Russia, which is using sanctions or other law enforcement actions to go after specific Russian entities that are acting in violation of sanctions or specifically in violation of the UN sanctions. So
to what extent do you think the Russian government would be able to shield those companies from the ill effects of those?
It's possible that they would try and do that, certainly rhetorically, such as the dismissive rhetorical gestures that we were discussing from President Putin. Nevertheless, if those companies want to use U.S. dollars, then they won't be able to if U.S. sanctions enforcement or law enforcement measures prevent them from doing that. And any Russian company or bank that wants to stay in the good graces of the United States will be very reluctant to facilitate such sanctions evasion activity going forward, notwithstanding what their political top cover may offer them at home.
So you really believe that these can be efficacious even without participation from the political sector in Russia, I guess?
I do, and we've seen that in other instances not related to North Korea. And for instance, in Iran, in the era before there was broad international consensus about the need for strong sanctions, going after companies and speaking directly to them was a way to have them get out far in front of their own governments on their willingness to abide by sanctions.
Great. So the second question I have, and I'm just a business guy at heart, so one of the things I think about is, what does success look like? When will we know that this has been successful? What does that look like, and what's the next step after that? So obviously, we want, as to the greatest extent possible, to either slow down or stop the technical progress, both with ICBMs and nuclear/hydrogen weapons. But what does it look like after that? What's the next step? We put in place these very, very tight sanctions and we just continue them forever? Or kind of tell us a little bit about what phase 2 would look like beyond putting in sanctions that theoretically would work?
I think one is, I should emphasize, we haven't talked about this that much. It's, the point of this is to have meaningful negotiations. I mean, that would be a sign of success. If North Korea, without accepting benefits, that's one new change in this administration compared to others. The benefits come after the concrete actions, not a reward for negotiating. But if there are meaningful negotiations that are toward denuclearization, creating limits on their nuclear program, you see intrusive inspections. I mean, inspectors have never gone outside of Yongbyon in North Korea, and yet we know there's other sites. And then and also, if there is movement toward a peace treaty, I mean, that's also something that is actually important to work into this whole process. So I think on that side, I think we know when we'll see it, and with the new criteria that are being used, that are really built on avoiding the mistakes of the past. I think that we'll know it when we see it.
I agree with most of that. I would caution that we want to make sure we get out of the trap of negotiations for negotiation's sake. I mean, I think from my perspective, a freeze is not as valuable as some people think it is. I think the next step, if we're talking about negotiations, is a demonstrable step by North Korea of its commitment to denuclearization, which would flip the negotiations on its head. And it used to be we freeze, then we drag them to denuclearization. We need to flip that on its head. But we also have to recognize that this might not be the regime that's willing to do that. And if sanctions can't get them there, then perhaps we need to start having that conversation.
Well, your second point notwithstanding, I very much agree with the first as well. I just wouldn't comment on the second, in that making sure that we don't just freeze here at the precipice of ICBM, at the precipice of being able to launch a nuclear attack, but instead move them back, because we've seen their willingness to renege on promises before. I don't want us to be a month, a year and a half away from an ICBM and find them reneging in the future. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee and also a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentlelady from St. Louis, Missouri. Recognized for 5 minutes, Ms. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this very timely hearing. In August, I traveled to Korea and Japan and China to dialogue with our allies in the peninsula, and I had the opportunity to visit not only the DMZ, but also to visit Dandong, where I watched Chinese trucks loaded with goods drive across the China-Korea Friendship Bridge into North Korea. 70% of North Korea's trade passes over that bridge. And it was a stark reminder that the United States should prioritize secondary sanctions against the Chinese companies and banks that sustain the regime. Mr. Ruggiero, I've had the pleasure of hearing your testimony in the Foreign Affairs Committee before. You wrote that North Korea is the fourth most sanctioned country in the world. And given the recent September UN Security Council resolution, how would you rank North Korea today, and given that certain Chinese investments and trade efforts are grandfathered in or exempted from the August and September UN sanctions, how effective do you think the resolutions will be? Please.
Sure, and I would just point out that February 2016 was number 8, and when I testified before this subcommittee in mid-July, it was number 5. So it's moving up the ranks, but it's got a long way to go, unfortunately. The way I like to look at it is very similar to Iran. In 2010, we had Resolution 1929. That was really the foundation, and sanctions passed by this U.S. Congress and implemented by the prior administration were what put Iran over the edge and led it back to the negotiating table. We need that here. We have the UN Foundation, but what we need is U.S. sanctions. And I would just say, it's concerning to hear the Treasury Secretary say, well, we're going to wait and see if the Chinese implement the UN resolution. I think that's the wrong approach. I think what we should be moving forward with right now is U.S. sanctions against Chinese banks. We should not give China a veto over U.S. sanctions. They might have a veto in the UN, but they should not have a veto over U.S. sanctions.
I agree. Mr. Klingler, barring a threat to the Kim regime's very survival, Kim will never come to the negotiating table in good faith, I believe. We must change Kim's financial calculus, as we've discussed here, which is why comprehensive secondary sanctions are so critical, I believe. I appreciated your statement on increasing inspection and interdiction of North Korean shipping. Would you support mandatory secondary sanctions on ports that don't implement required inspections? I agree we must pay much more attention to this.
I agree, and that's something that the Congress has been looking at, is particularly if a port doesn't implement required sanctions, then measures such as any ship cannot transit that port and enter the United States waters for 6 months or so. So it is an area that has been looking at. One thing we've been hampered by in the UN resolutions is that all of them have been passed with what's called Chapter 7, Article 41 authority, where we're not allowed to board a ship on the high seas, even if it's suspected of carrying nuclear missile contraband. So we've been advocating Chapter 42, which would give us the authority to have Coast Guard or law enforcement agencies intercept and board ships.
Doesn't the recent package allow us to board now and others on the high seas? In terms of member states, I think they have some new tools, don't they, to stop high seas smuggling of these prohibited products?
I believe that was included in the original U.S. draft, but it was something that I think was tossed overboard, as it were, that did not make it in the final resolution.
Yes, Mr. Ruggiero.
I think that's the reasonable ground standard, but it still goes back to what Mr. Klingner is saying. You need flag state consent or master's consent in order to board the ship.
Okay, real quickly here, Mr. Albright, in my view, North Korea already has nuclear weapons. For my constituents without access to classified information, it would be helpful if you can explain from public sources how many nuclear weapons the Kim regime may have and where they may be.
Oh, yeah, we estimate they have 13 to 30 at the end, as of the end of 2016. I mean, it's a rough estimate. We have no idea where they are.
13 to
30, 30. And I think the U.S. government estimates, I believe, are higher than that. But I think I've worked on this problem since 1985, and I've visited North Korea a couple times, met their nuclear people. I think they're not giants technologically, and they encounter problems. So that estimate tends to be lower than the U.S. government one, but it's still a significant number, and it's growing.
The gentlelady's time is expired.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. Thank you, Mr. Albright.
Thank you. And because of the interest in the witness's testimony, members here, I think, are interested in a second round of questioning. If we can seek the indulgence of the witnesses for a brief second round, we would appreciate that. And with that, I'll recognize myself for an additional 5 minutes of questioning. Just to revisit this issue of effectiveness of sanctions. And you all heard the comments and questions of my colleague from California, Mr. Sherman, on that point, that over the last several decades, there has been maybe a lower priority, but there have been sanctions nonetheless on North Korea, and yet we've seen a continuous belligerence, a continuous development, and an acceleration of the development of the nuclear program and the capabilities of the Kim regime, particularly in recent years. So my question to anyone who wants to answer is, what is different about, if anything, about the foreign policy, the sanctions efforts of the current administration, particularly the efforts of the Ambassador Haley and the UN sanctions packages that she's been able to secure at the United Nations? We'll start with that question and start with Mr. Albright.
Yeah, I think one is I'd like to go back. I mean, U.S. policy has been to try to stop North Korea acquiring goods, and in the 80s and 90s, a lot of effort was made to kick them out of Europe because their missions would go to companies and buy the goods for their nuclear program. And they were kicked out. What was not anticipated was that they would move to China and set up shop there and buy the same goods from European companies, get them to China, and then send them by truck up to the nuclear program. And so the problem has been, and this is I would say the most important change to me in this administration, is they're willing to risk trade conflict with China to solve this problem. And since North Korea set up shop in North Korea, the administrations have not been willing to do that until this one. And I think that's critical.
Mr. Ruggiero, as you answer that question, you've read the draft proposal, the draft bill that we've presented to you. Could you comment on that bill and the extent to which it would ratchet up this pressure through secondary sanctions on the regime?
You know, from my approach, we tend to get ourselves in this provocation response cycle, and we've done that over the last 10 years. But I agree with Dr. Albright. This administration has gone after China and Russia to an extent that we haven't seen before. It needs to be sustained. I think in the past we've convinced ourselves I personally have written, I've delivered, I've been in the same room when these have been delivered. We give China a list and we convince ourselves we've done a tough way forward, and the Chinese just sort of hand wave and we're okay with that. In terms of the legislation, I noted earlier the due diligence component, but I would also, beyond the various legislations that are out there, it's oversight, because I think that the key aspect here is ensuring that these bills and that eventually become law are actually implemented. There are many companies that are still not sanctioned and should be subject to sanctions, even from the sanctions law last year.
And can I just ask Mr. Klingner on the heels of that answer, again, revisiting your comment that the importance of the distinction between the UN incremental enforcement and the UN sanctions, the 2 rounds of UN sanctions, and Congress and the administration and the United States acting independently, how much more pressure would the legislation being proposed or U.S. independent additional action on secondary sanctions, how much of a difference would that make above and beyond the most recent round of UN sanctions?
Right. As I've said, is the UN sanctions each one is incrementally better than the last. We can be cynical or positive about moving the ball a few yards down the field. But the U.S. actions, I think, are critical. It's ones that we can do ourselves. We don't need permission by China. And to be honest, I don't see why we're having a debate about whether we should be implementing secondary sanctions. They're enforcing U.S. law. Why should anyone be against enforcing our law to the full degree? So the legislation, as well as the oversight through which Congress can hold the executive branch's feet to the fire to try to push them to fully enforce the laws that are either on the books or could be on the books. The 3 main actions the Obama administration did last year were really because they were pressured through the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act.
Well, I think the difference here it's the things that you mentioned, but it's also an issue of lax enforcement. And so enforcement is very, very critical. The UN panel of experts points to continued lax enforcement of UN sanctions by foreign countries. So these secondary sanctions, I think, are absolutely critical in applying the additional peaceful pressure. And just I'll let Ms. Rosenberg conclude on that point. These secondary sanctions, you think, would make a difference from previous efforts?
I do. I think we've seen that happen in the last year and this year as well, and I think it would do more. One of the challenges about the new UN security measures passed this week are that they're not, of course, they're not self-reinforcing, and where they rely on a reduction or a cap on, for example, petroleum, that's something that the UN will have to do accounting on. We have problems with inaccurate or unavailable data, with countries, member states, not feeding the data to the United Nations. So I think there's a very high likelihood that we're not going to see compliance with this, even just as a matter of arithmetic and slow and poor reporting. What that means is that when the United States can impose its secondary sanctions to call out and highlight where foreign countries are not undertaking their requirements as UN member states, it will have a major and significant effect in bringing them where they are willing to cooperate to do so.
My time has expired, and I'll now recognize the gentleman from Arkansas for a second round of questioning, Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Chairman. So we also learned in our previous testimony on the subject that in the Standing Committee in the Politburo in China that 2 of the 7 members are from provinces that abut North Korea, and that the presumption is that one gets on the Standing Committee of the Politburo by hitting goals established on economic development, et cetera. So I'm interested in your view on China's seriousness here, and do you think that they can recognize what Secretary Tillerson has laid out quite clearly, that we don't have aims for U.S. presence or Western presence at their border? And so given that, comment on that Politburo political view from your point of view, and also, do you anticipate that China would be more helpful after they have their significant party Congress that I believe is to be held in October? talk about, in other words, let's talk about the politics in China, about them understanding the United States' sincerity in ending this issue once and for all. Mr. Klinger, you want to start?
Yeah, I think China is as helpful as it needs to be to prevent the U.S. from taking further action on our own. The message that has been given to China, but I think needs to be given and more forcefully, is you don't want a crisis on your border, but your lack of pressure on North Korea is only encouraging Pyongyang to continue going down that path that you don't like. It's also inducing the U.S. and its allies to take defensive measures, missile defense, et cetera, that China doesn't like, but we are being pushed into it by your ally. So you can pay me now or you can pay me later. There's either you need to increase pressure or we're going to head toward that crisis you don't want, China.
Your assessment of will their diplomatic or public position be any different after they complete their party Congress?
I've become pretty cynical about North Korea and China, and I think it's just that they talk well, they implement for about 1 to 4 months after each UN resolution, and then they back off.
Mr. Ruggiero, comment on that?
I mean, I agree 100%. I think that anyone who believes that China will be more cooperative after the Party Congress is falling into Beijing's trap again. Everybody said, you know, they had a good summit at Mar-a-Lago, and the Chinese they're on board. And what turned out, they were not on board. I mean, unfortunately I can do that over the last 10 years. That has happened time and time again. And to your question on how do we measure seriousness, I think that's a good question. The way how I measure it is the Chinese should not be closing North Korean accounts. They should be closing their own nationals account, and they should be in Dandong stopping those trucks from going over the bridge. They should be in those companies and saying, here are the sanctions, how are you implementing them? They should be in those banks doing the same thing. Until they do that, they are not serious.
Appreciate Dr. Albright.
I agree. I can't read I don't know Chinese politics, so I can't really say, but I would agree with Mr. Ruggiero that we do need signs of seriousness. And I can give an example of a country wanted to inspect the customs areas at the border with China and North Korea, a country with vital trade arrangements with China, and they weren't allowed in. So I think they were literally blocked by the private company running the customs storage area. So I think it's these signs that we're looking for, and I'd love to see some Chinese busted. I've been involved in federal prosecutions of Chinese national, at least one Chinese national, prosecuted successfully here. He was never, or his colleagues were never prosecuted in China, and so I think these signs are critical.
So, Ms. Rosenberg, so enforcement we know and upping the ante, but talk about who's a bigger trading partner of China, the United States or North Korea? Can we use that stick?
There's certainly no question there. To refer back to the question posed by the chair at the beginning, what has changed? One thing I will say, and apropos of what you've just said, the willingness of the current U.S. president to offer tough rhetoric on North Korea, including raising the possibility of whether trade can and should occur between the United States and China. Even if that isn't just meant to send a really strong signal, that is different, and that has clearly been a huge wake-up call. So obviously now the devil is in the details. How do you do implementation? And to be frank, when we've seen China comply with other international sanctions frameworks for Iran and Russia, even others, when they have gotten with the program, it has never looked like them saying to U.S. diplomats who go sit there and pass them intelligence, we got this, we're with you. It comes under a different guise. And so I would welcome to see China come forward with its own domestic law enforcement or regulatory action against certain companies as a matter of going after money laundering or prosecuting corruption, which they clearly have an interest to do. And if it happens to have an effect on their relationship with North Korea, all the better. I don't need them to get out in front, and they'll have a problem politically looking like they're capitulating to U.S. sanctions, but if they do it as a measure of domestic financial sector integrity, all the better.
I agree with that. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the witnesses for appearing as well, and would indicate that we've had many duties related to some adverse circumstances that we've encountered related to bad weather, and that's putting it mildly. And these things have attracted my attention, so my apologies for not being here for the entirety of the hearing. I am concerned about the sanctions. I do have some questions that probably have already been posed, so please forgive me for being redundant or superfluous. My initial question is, if we can perfect the sanctions as codified, what would be the impact on China first? And then I'd like to move to the secondary portion of the question, which relates to the impact on North Korea. So on China, what would be the impact if we perfect these sanctions as codified? And I will leave this question to whomever would like to respond initially.
I think, thank you for the question. I think that a way to perfect or improve upon the sanctions that exist, and they are extensive and they are powerful, is to go after them prosecuting an aggressive strategy of implementation and enforcement. And that may or may not include secondary sanctions measures, but by making an example of these sanctions and calling out the companies in China, certainly in North Korea, entities and persons, but also in China and other international facilitators of North Korean proliferation entities or its economic activity, that is a strong and important way to improve upon these sanctions and make them more efficacious.
Thank you. The efficacy of the sanctions, please, would you care, sir?
I mean, I would just take a step back. I mean, there's obviously going to be an impact on Chinese companies and North Korean companies, but I think as Dr. Albright noted, China has been a problem for a long time. In terms of proliferation, whether it's with Iran or North Korea. I think a successful goal could be that China finally realizes that just issuing, a notice from their Commerce Department with a list of goods that are prohibited is not enough. That they need to do more, engaging their own companies, engaging their banks, and law enforcement actions, inspections at the border, authorizing other countries to do those inspections. The Chinese are, in a lot of ways, the center of a market, and it's the market for proliferators, and that's a problem. And until they realize that they have to change their ways, we're unfortunately not going to be successful.
Let me follow up with this question. If we perfect the sanctions proposed in their entirety, what will be the impact on North Korea?
One impact would be probably their gas centrifuge program that makes weapon-grade uranium would probably stop at some point. It may take a year or two, but they do depend on what we would consider perishable goods in order to operate that plant, and they don't make those goods. So I think if we had a perfect set of sanctions, I think you could cause serious damage to the progress of their nuclear program. You couldn't stop what they already have, but you could stop more.
Please do not assume that I have a position based upon the questions I'm posing. I think that these are some things that I just need to hear answers to. Next question has to do with China's position that if the sanctions create turmoil to the extent that North Korea becomes a government that no longer exists for all practical purposes and people start to flood into China, they've always raised that as a possibility. Is it possible that these sanctions could create such a circumstance if completely implemented against North Korea? Because China is the means by which we get to North Korea. So would that create the breakdown in governance?
I mean, that's China's fear. There's been even some newer talk in China that if in anticipation of that the People's Army would occupy part of North Korea in order to block refugees coming into China and also to build housing.
So the expectation is that China would somehow seal North Korea such that people in North Korea could not migrate into China?
There's discussion of that. I mean, it's been on the table a long time, but the discussion is recurring. But China fears that, and that's part of the problem. I mean, China fears the instability in North Korea that could create problems for itself, and it worries about that more than it worries about North Korea's nuclear weapons. So it's at the crux of the matter, and U.S. has to solve that problem for China.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 1 minute to the chairman.
Thank you. And very briefly, Mr. Ruggiero, just to follow up on this hearing and the legislative proposal to impede North Korea's access to finance that has been discussed here today, would the passage of this legislation that's being proposed or the mere introduction of a bill that directed Treasury to impose these additional secondary sanctions, would that, in your judgment, give Secretary Tillerson and Ambassador Haley additional leverage in their negotiations with China and with Russia with respect to North Korea?
I think that's right. When you look at SASADA, the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions and Divestment Act of 2010, only 2 banks were designated, China's Kunlun Bank and Iraq's Elof Bank. Elof Bank was relieved of those sanctions. There were many threats associated with that, and banks changed their compliance procedures because of that bill.
Thank you. I yield back to my friend from Ohio.
Thank you, Chairman. South Korea has announced that they plan to participate in some decapitation exercises. This is kinetic, not financial, presumptively. And I guess I'm just curious for the panel what your assessment of North Korea's reaction to the rhetoric, if not, in fact, the deeds.
Actually, a year ago, the South Korean Minister of Defense of the previous administration had announced that they have a special forces unit whose mission is decapitation. He also emphasized they have surface-to-surface missiles, and then just a week or two ago, they demonstrated an attack a practice attack using their F-15Ks. And they had announced that they would conduct such an attack if they detected signs that North Korea was about to attack. Pyongyang responded, well, we will preempt your preemption if they detect indications that South Korea is going to attack. So one of my concerns is the risk of miscalculation by either Korea or the U.S. in that we sort of stumble across a red line into some kind of kinetic military action based on, very difficult to discern intelligence.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's accurate personally. I think I'm also curious, at some point, doesn't this make having a nuclear deterrent, given their massively weaker military stature, a rational choice for North Korea to pursue?
Not really. I mean, no one's planning to invade North Korea. I mean, the decapitation is a reaction to North Korea strikes, some of which happened against South Korea. The sinking of their ship by the North Korean submarine, the artillery attack, where they did not respond, and they've said, next time we will. So I think these kind of actions, I think, have to be put in context, but the background is no one's planning. I mean, Saddam had enemies. Libya had enemies.
Yes, I understand.
North Korea doesn't have anybody who wants to invade them, so they don't need nuclear weapons.
I understand what our perspective is, and I understand our probability of invading North Korea is really low. I think if on the other side of the border, they don't understand that, frankly. I think when we do our rotational efforts and they see division after division after division getting experience in Korea, if I'm a North Korean, that looks a lot like people are preparing to do that. Respect the ability to draw different conclusions. I guess the next piece I want to talk about is our naval power. Obviously, massive differential in naval power there. Of the $15 billion mighty North Korean economy, how much of it is dependent upon access to the sea? Anybody know?
The North Korean naval forces and air forces are small and antiquated. So they have given their focus in the past on ground forces, and then as those conditions sort of deteriorated, even in the 90s when I was at the CIA, they compensated by declining conventional capabilities by focusing on asymmetric capabilities like nuclear weapons, missiles, special forces,
Right. Are they dependent upon the sea for their oil?
Not exclusively. They have the capacity to take tanker or delivery as well as a pipeline from North Korea, from China.
So pipeline, but they do get a fair bit by ocean.
Or tanker over that bridge, for example. Those are all.
Oh, tanker trucks, not
Right.
ocean tankers.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I guess the last thing is in the ability to use naval power. What portion of, if you took this up to the next thing at a blockade, short of force, this is control the ocean, is there an ability to have a discernible impact on North Korea's economy?
I would imagine. I mean, you also, you have to consider this possibility of a submarine-launched ballistic missile. I mean, they're far from that, but you have to worry about their submarine force. And I think that, but in answer to your question, I think certainly an embargo would affect their economy.
Yeah, that's the question. This is the next step short of kinetic force. Mr. Chairman, time's expired. I yield.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witness for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. This hearing is adjourned.